Hello, Om Shanti, and a very warm welcome to today's masterclass, one of 21 masterclasses in new consciousness, new ways of thinking, being and doing in today's rapidly changing world. My name is Philippa, and together we'll be listening to the experiences of yogis and meditators from right around the world, people from all backgrounds and all walks of life, as they share with us their top tips, their navigational tools for surviving in these very challenging times that we're now facing. Well, of course, the coronavirus pandemic worldwide has brought with it a roller coaster of different emotions, right from the initial shock and surprise at what was unfolding, to then the fear of what would happen if I became ill, or perhaps even more a fear of what would happen if a loved one became ill and I was physically unable to be with them, to care for them. And then all the different emotions that we've had through the lockdown, through to now perhaps the anxiety around our financial situation as we look at facing a very uncertain economic future. So that is the theme of today's masterclass. It is really how to process and manage our emotions. Well, all of our speakers are students and teachers of the Brahmakumaris World Spiritual University, a place for understanding the self, for looking at questions around the soul. And the subject taught is Raja Yoga meditation, and there are teaching centres and meditation centres in over 110 countries right around the world, and an active presence in even more countries than that. It's an organisation that was founded in India in 1936 with a series of visions and teachings that came through the original founder, Brahma Baba. And they're very much teachings that are geared towards this particular period of time that we're going through now, what some would see as a period of transition. Now, Brahma Baba decided quite early on that it should be women that were kept in the front, making the Brahmakumaris now the largest spiritual organisation of its kind to be led by women. And their activities range from a permanent office at the United Nations in New York right through to working with the very poorest tribal communities in the desert plains of Rajasthan in India and everything in between. Well, let me introduce you to our guide for today's journey. Dr. Sarah Eagger is a consultant psychiatrist. She spent her career working for the NHS in London, seeing patients, as well as being a senior clinical lecturer at Imperial College in London. Now, with her own private practice, she's also a certified mindful self-compassion teacher and chair of the Janki Foundation, which promotes spirituality in healthcare. She also sits on the executive committee of the Spirituality Special Interest Group at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, having previously been the chair. And on top of all that, she was also one of the first Westerners to come into contact with the Brahmakumaris in her native Australia in the late 1970s. So she's had a lifetime of exploring this relationship between meditation and spirituality and mental health. So Sarah, welcome so much to Masterclasses. It's great to have you here today, joining us from your home in London. Now, you've obviously had a whole career in clinical practice, and you've seen very much firsthand the stresses and strains that healthcare workers are often under. And of course, this has only intensified with the outbreak of COVID-19. How well do you think they've been supported through this very emotional experience?
Well, I think being a doctor or a healthcare practitioner at the best of times is challenging and can be very stressful. And there has been studies done on this, and I think people are a little bit concerned because I think when you're in the midst of an emergency, you're running a bit on adrenaline and you're obviously reacting to what's in front of you. But there's also a sense that there may be a bit of an aftermath, that some of the workers will be suffering from what we call post-traumatic stress, that the reality of so many deaths and deaths that have been difficult for people not surrounded by their loved ones, that in and of itself will cause an additional stress to healthcare professionals. In fact, at the Janki Foundation, we were aware of the kind of stresses that healthcare professionals were under, and even before this happened, developed an app which we call Happy Dote, where we thought for ourselves, what are the most challenging situations that we've faced as healthcare practitioners? And they were things like having to give bad news, losing hope, being surrounded by chaos, feeling that your colleagues need support, feeling stressed and overwhelmed. So we already recognised that these situations were ones in which some kind of spiritual wisdom, some kind of perspective, some kind of preparation of oneself for having to face these situations would be a good idea. And that's why we developed this app to just give people little short meditations to help them stabilise themselves, to really be able to go into a situation where they're feeling prepared for what they're going to have to face.
So that's a very practical tool for anyone who finds themselves working in a frontline situation, the Happy Dote app, which you can download. And I know that in the UK at least there's been a huge outpouring of support for NHS workers who are working on the front line, and indeed all frontline workers. And we now have a weekly ritual where at 8 p.m. the whole country comes to a standstill and people gather outside their front doors and clap for the NHS to show their support. And in some regards, seeing someone else go through an emotionally challenging time can almost be as hard as the observer of someone else's stress as it is going through the experience ourselves. How do we cope with seeing other people go through very challenging, difficult emotions?
Well, I think the work that I've done through the mindful self-compassion teaching has taught me a lot about this, and this idea of what's maybe the difference between empathy and compassion. And so when we see other people suffering, we do resonate with their pain. We do feel what they're going through. And you need to do that to know how to help people. And in a sense, being sensitive to other people's pain and suffering, empathizing with it, understanding what's causing it, and then responding is how we develop compassion. And so you do need to be able to empathize with other people. But there have been research studies shown which indicate that empathy is more draining. It lights up different parts of the brain when they do scans. And so what can happen is that you can get caught up in the negative emotions of other people. So empathy is important, but if you get too caught up in feeling what other people are feeling, you're not really then in a position to help them or help them come out of their suffering, which is really the essence of compassion. And so compassion in and of itself is a kind of energy that we have. It's something that we can use both to help ourselves but to help other people. And the brain scans show that when people have really tuned into a compassion practice or understand that energy and can let it flow from themselves, that it's a different part of the brain that lights up. And it's not a draining kind of emotion, it's an energizing emotion. So I think the understanding the difference between empathy, sympathy, compassion is quite an important tool in helping us manage our emotions and how to regulate them. And that's what we are trying to do when we are encouraging people to learn self-compassion practices.
We'll come on and talk about self-compassion in just a moment, but I just want to stay with this compassion for other people for just a second, because very often when we're with people who are going through emotional difficulties or emotional trauma, our instinct is to try and go straight to a solution, to try and fix them, to try and make them better, to try and cheer them up. But in many situations, what's actually needed more is just to be with someone, which I guess is what the word compassion is getting at, is having feelings with someone else. And yet we've got to be comfortable with our own pain and discomfort in order to be comfortable with someone else's pain. Can you say something a bit more about this relationship between someone else's pain and yet not having to try and fix them?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot being written about being a rescuer, and a lot of people in the helping professions often use that act of helping others to really act out their own needs. And so it's very important to see when I'm helping others, am I really taking care of myself as well? And often when you're not getting enough sleep or enough food, it's seen as being very noble. But in fact, if you're getting run down and you're getting unwell and you're getting distressed, you're not really able to help others as well. And so I think you're absolutely right. This idea of compassion is to suffer with, but it's also to bring people out of their suffering. And to do that, you need strength. And to do that, you need to have really looked after your own well-being. And that is the absolute core of what it means to be a compassionate practitioner, is to learn how to use that same energy for your own care and well-being. And often we're not very good at that. We're trying to, as you say, fix it or come up with a solution. And yet when people often, if people are dying, and that's the reality of it, and there's not much more you can do, being a loving, connected presence is really what's required. And so to be able to sit with my own fear, be able to sit with my own pain, my own discomfort with the situation, in a way I need to have practiced that beforehand. I need to have come to terms with it or been able to face it, because obviously we're all going to die at some point, and yet we don't talk about death very much. And yet this whole COVID thing, I think, has really brought death to the forefront in our society. And to think about my own death and how would I like to die, and what have I left undone, or what is it that I would need to do to feel that when my time comes, I can leave easily and I can leave with a sense of completion and no regrets or things that I feel I should have done. So all this kind of preparation for leaving. I think someone asked me the other day, what about sudden death? Because I think that's what COVID is presenting us with, is situations where people we weren't expecting to die. Obviously there's sudden death always in society, but this is on a massive scale. And so it's the suddenness of it. It's the inability to say our goodbyes. It's the lack of preparation, which I think is shaking people a lot. And so is there something I can be doing now in my everyday life which is preparing me for something that I don't know when it's going to come? So a part of me has to always be aware that it is going to come at some point. So how am I preparing myself for that?
I mean, clearly our emotional lives these days are complicated and probably getting more complicated as time goes on. And in order to manage our own inner world, our own inner experience, of course, we need to have a great deal of tenderness and care of ourselves. And this is where the whole idea of self-compassion comes in, that you've done a lot of work on. Can you just define for us what you understand by this concept of self-compassion? What is it?
Well, I feel that self-compassion is when we see others suffering, we notice we have that natural tendency to reach out and to want to help, to soothe, to comfort, to care. And so we know we have that capacity. It's something inherent in us. And we often find it's much easier to give that kind of energy to other people. But when it comes to giving it to myself, we're not so good. And this obviously applies for healthcare professionals too. And so when I make a mistake or I fail or I'm going through a hard time, often my response to myself is kind of, pull yourself together, or useless at that, or there's this strong inner critic voice. And in fact, they've done research in medical and healthcare professionals and find that often they do have a very strong inner critic. And this is what makes them more vulnerable to depression or mental health issues in their working life. And so this attitude of love and compassion, how do we then turn that and use it for ourselves? Like, become your own best friend, virtually, is what we're saying. Use that kindness, that empathy, that concern that we can have for other people to be able to use that energy and give that to myself. And that's what the self-compassion practices are teaching us, making us aware of that inner voice. How am I talking to myself? And I think, when we stop and pause, or when we meditate, we begin to really see how that voice can sometimes not be very kind and not be very friendly. And if I can go on to explain, what we've noticed with that inner critical voice is that triggers the same neuropsychological, the same neurotransmitter effect in our brain as any kind of other external stress. So it's triggering our stress systems when we speak to ourselves rather in this way. And that's very important to observe and notice, that my tone of voice, the words that I use, the energy with which I'm responding to my own pain and suffering is really having an effect on how I'm regulating my emotions.
And you talk within self-compassion about the yin and yang of self-compassion, about the soft compassion, which is caring, but the other, which is when to draw a boundary and have a little bit of tough love, perhaps, with others or with the situation or with yourself. How does that work, these two aspects of self-compassion?
Well, I think often when we're talking about being kind and loving and looking after ourselves, we're talking about the soothing system and comforting system, which most people would recognise is an innate system that mothers have towards babies, that as human beings we all have this capacity to soothe and care. And so we're learning how to soothe ourselves. And that's triggering our endorphins and our oxytocin, and that's giving us that very safe, comforting, calming down anxiety, which is obviously the anxiety is a response to feeling threatened or fears. And that's being triggered a lot these days with COVID and everything, that level of anxiety of external threat. But another aspect of looking after yourself, we could say that's the kind of yin, the soft, fluffy sort of energy. But the yang energy is this more, I need to provide for myself, I need to protect myself, I need to motivate myself. And so it's a powerful energy. It's not anger. And I think sometimes people feel in order to assert themselves and say no, that you have to kind of use this energy of anger. But no, you can still be like that, but very clear, very assertive, if you like, constructive in saying this behavior is not acceptable, or this is not constructive behavior for myself. So you're using that same energy, which really comes out of love, I would say. When we trace it back, we're looking at what is the essence of myself and where is that energy coming from. So that energy of kindness, of caring and soothing for myself is one aspect, but the energy of protecting myself and really having clear sense of who I am and what is constructive and beneficial for me and what is not constructive, what's destructive for me, both in my own habits towards myself, but also in the way other people treat me. That's also an aspect of compassion.
Often people experience such intense emotion that they feel it physically. So if their heart is broken, they have a pain in their chest. If they have a lot of anxiety, they'll feel a knot in their stomach. There is this huge relationship between our mental, emotional well-being and our physical well-being. And I heard a saying once, which I quite liked, which is that the body is constantly eavesdropping on the mind. In other words, listening in to what we're thinking. And what I find fascinating is that the thoughts that we're having, the emotional responses that we're having, are setting up an actual physiological response, releasing chemicals. And you've talked about endorphins, but can you give us an idea of the spectrum of different emotional responses and how that is triggering chemical releases in our body?
Yes, I think it's very interesting when you look at this two-way traffic. It's between the mind and the body. It's always going on. And often the thoughts and feelings that arise in our mind are going through very quickly. And so they're often quite hard to capture. And yet, as you say, the body is listening and the body is feeling it. And so over time, if we develop that habit, or we are having that anxious thought for a long time, then it starts to have that impact on the body. So the anxiety system, the flight, fight, freeze, which most people have heard about, that's triggering adrenaline, it's triggering the kind of cortisols and things like that, which eventually will make me have a stomach ulcer or make my blood pressure stay high. And so the body really is trying to adapt to these emotions, but it's over a chronic period, over time, it is going to manifest as illness. And so there is a spectrum, and I think this is what's interesting in mental health treatments, is that we notice it can start with worry, but it starts at a thought level. And so the thought level will just be something where I think, something bad is going to happen. It's a feeling, and we might call that catastrophizing, or we overgeneralize, or we assume something. And a very common and well tried and tested method is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And all that's doing is saying, look at your thoughts and check them out and see, are they really true? Is it really true that this is the case in every situation? And often we'll find that we're making these kind of generalizations, or we've got into the habit of thinking a certain way, which is then triggering these stress hormones in my body, and then my body is really suffering from the result of all that, and it manifests as disease. But I think even before, so cognitive behavioral therapy is looking at it at a thought level and just really challenging your thoughts. But I think the practice of meditation is doing even more than that, because it's asking us to be aware of what we're thinking, but then actually transforming our thoughts or putting in a different kind of thought to that thought. So it's taking that basic premise, if you like, of thoughts and feelings are creating a neurotransmitter response in our brain, which is then affecting our body onto a deeper level.
And I'm curious, from your own experience, to what extent you think people can retrain their minds and their thinking process. Because for many, if a situation happens, they're going to have that emotional response. And they might think, well, it's unrealistic to not, it's human nature. Or if we look at the situation in the world, there are so many triggers for our emotional reaction. If we look at what is happening environmentally, if we look at, plastics in the ocean, or extinction of species, or whatever it is out there in the world that can elicit a very strong emotional response. Some people would say, well, you can't not react to that. It's going to have an effect. And yet your response will be impacting on you, and yet you do still want to be caring. That's quite a hard balance to find.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that's why I felt the self-compassion practices have been really helpful, because they're not denying your experience. They're not saying that what's going on for you is bad or wrong. You're accepting and acknowledging your reaction. So it's not about suppressing your feelings or resisting them, but then, as you say, stepping back maybe a little and thinking, okay, this may be true and this is going on and I accept it, but what effect ultimately is this reaction going to have on my well-being and also my usefulness, my ability to respond? And so you do need wisdom as well. And so it's not saying that the reaction is wrong. It's then being able to respond to yourself with kindness and love and say, oh, you were hurt by that comment, or that was very stressful, or, that's very sad that you lost that person. So you're really acknowledging and being with your own feelings. And that's a really important first step, because if you don't do that, if you don't acknowledge where you are at now and what your reaction is, it's going to be very difficult to have an authentic, caring response to it, or to do anything more constructive with that feeling. So it is a process where you start by, this is where I'm at now, let me bring kindness to that experience, and then let's see what the next step is. And it's very powerful how even just that little intervention can actually change the course of events. You may be having an argument with someone, someone's provoking you, and you're getting very caught up in it. Or a situation even with the news, listening to the news, COVID every day, that's really, starting to make me feel very anxious and everything. So just to stop and say, this is really tough actually to keep hearing all this news of people dying and all the fears. So just give myself kindness and love, because I'm in this position now where I'm actually having to hear all this news, or this person's trying to get a rise out of me, or the situation is really triggering something in me. So before I even get into all of that, just to stop and say, let me just give myself some kindness and love just because I'm in this situation. And because that is the right response to suffering, not to make it go away, not necessarily to change it, just in the first instance, just to acknowledge and be with it and give myself kindness because of that situation.
You talked about the frontline healthcare workers possibly having post-traumatic stress because of what they've been through. And I think there's an extent to which, all of us are probably carrying some degree of, whether you call it post-traumatic stress or just, a stress disorder of some kind because of the hugeness of this experience. And yet in self-compassion, you talk very much about the importance of rest and recovery and recalibrating after having had a difficult experience. Why is that so important?
Well, I think they're noticing this in a lot of stress work anyway, before even COVID came along. But it does come from the idea in sport that when you're really pushing yourself very hard, that if you stop and recover, even for a short interval, that you're able to go much longer, that it builds resilience. And so this concept of recovery is really important, because in healthcare, you can just be going for hours, and with all this PPE and everything, people not even being able to take proper breaks and everything. But you can take a break in your mind. You can stop for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and really just give yourself kindness and love, and just calm that whole nervous system down, because you'll be operating on high adrenaline. And so you have that capacity, you have that power to be able to really just say, let me take a few minutes of quiet here, of peace, of silence. As you say, that can be challenging for people, which is why these little commentaries, these meditations can help. They can help you get into that frame of mind. They can help you come down and recover quite quickly. But it is also the case of just practicing. If you're used to, through some kind of practice of meditation or breathing or anything that really calms your nervous system down, that's a good practice to have, and to do it quite regularly throughout the day.
I mean, you've had a career of being a healthcare provider at the same time as developing your own practice in meditation. What insight can you give us into how actually your experience of meditation in a moment by moment, day by day situation feeds into and really nurtures you? How can we use meditation practically in that way?
Well, I think for me, meditation has been a very profound journey of me understanding that even though I'm creating thoughts and feelings, I'm something different to those thoughts and feelings. And it might be a bit like a painter. A painter has the paints and they're putting the thing on the canvas. But in fact, it's the painter who's creating it, and he knows the painting is different to what he is. And it's a bit like that there is something we might call the observer self or the intrinsic self. And as you explore in meditation the different levels, so you begin to see that thoughts are traveling through your mind, that feelings are arising, but underneath or below or in the center of that, there's you, the observer, and you can create, or you can experience a little bit of distance between what you're creating. And then you begin to realize actually you can also develop a bit of mastery, and you can decide which color paint you want to use. So which thought you begin to become a bit more discriminating, and you can say, actually, that's not a very useful thought. This is a more useful thought. And the kind of thoughts that I've realized are really helpful are the ones that take me back into what I would call my true self or my true nature. And you begin to realize that the thoughts in the mind and the feelings that arise are expressions of you, but they're also noise. And you can go back and back and backtrack back until you find a place which actually is completely silent, completely still. And there you just feel at home. There you feel restful. There you feel, this is me. And that essence of me is love. It's peaceful, it's loving, it's powerful, it's clear, it's really the best you, but it's completely silent in a very full way. And so for me, that's been the journey of meditation, is tracking back in a way through how my body's feeling, how my mind is, how my emotions are, and then getting underneath that and into something which is just completely safe and peaceful, and I feel is the real me.
It's very beautiful to hear what you're saying and to hear those words. And even more interesting when you consider that you've had a whole career in medicine as a consultant psychiatrist, and you've sat as a chair on this special interest group in spirituality for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And I wonder how you have found it in your career as someone who has this belief and understanding of the self as a soul, and yet working alongside practitioners who have a very physical understanding of the brain being in charge. How do you reconcile those two worldviews? And how far do you think medicine has now got towards accepting this idea of soul and these essential soul qualities that you're talking about?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think when I started in psychiatry, I certainly felt like I was a bit of an oddball, and this sense of the brain and the true self being two different entities, and that the true self or the soul, or something that was using the brain, was not something that a lot of people believed. They were very into brain scans and neurotransmitters and all this kind of stuff. But in fact, I began to realize that there were other psychiatrists who had those kind of inklings and also experiences in their life. And in around 2000, there was a group at the Royal College of Psychiatrists which developed a special interest group in spirituality. And that was a real turning point for me, because I think before that I kept my spiritual life separate, but I began to see other people could also see that there was a room for this kind of worldview in psychiatry. And clearly not everyone subscribes to it, but I think there's been more and more respect and accepting that that is the way a lot of people experience the world, especially people who use mental health systems. They often have deep spiritual experiences or deep spiritual beliefs, and they would like their psychiatrists to be able to acknowledge that and not use that as sort of saying that, that's more evidence of your craziness. And in fact, it was really interesting. I was just reading an article where they were talking about how even within faith communities, the ability to accept people who have mental health problems is sometimes challenging. And it's this whole issue of how do we accept people who experience the world and things differently to us. And they were saying that compassion is important, but in fact, more than that, when you're dealing with other people, respecting their dignity is really the key. Because compassion can sometimes come across as feeling sorry for someone or giving them pity, and you have to watch that line. But if you always imagine and think of the dignity of each human being and the dignity and respect you need to have for their belief systems and their experiences, that puts you on an equal footing. That puts you in a position where you're able to stay generous and open-hearted and accept the other's reality. So I feel in my journey of being both a psychiatrist and on a spiritual journey, that as time has gone on, that acceptance has grown. I think there will always be people who feel that it's a step too far and it's not within their realm, but I think there's respect now for people who do think about being soul conscious, about consciousness being some other dimension, and even God, if you like, even a higher being or a divine being. That idea has entered the dialogues, and in fact it was really interesting, even within that group, that special interest group, we were in the executive, and we have lots of different programs and we try and always explore the spiritual aspect, but someone said, why don't we ever talk about God? We're all here because we believe in God in our own way, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, everyone, we're all in this group together. And yet we said, we don't really ever talk about God. And I said, that's a really good question. It's almost, again, it's like our belief system is our most private thing. And our relationship with God is our most private thing. And yet we knew in that room that was the thing that linked us all. And yet we were still a little bit cautious about discussing it.
Very interesting, and in a way we've had the whole interfaith dialogue, which has brought different faith communities to a greater place of understanding where each other is coming from. And now maybe, science and the medical profession and spirituality are taking an attitude of, well, look, what can we learn from each other? How can we get the best of each to have a greater understanding? So for you to have a special interest group that is even looking to extend that understanding into there being a presence, a divine presence of some kind, that can be part of our picture when you're looking at each human individual and their experience in this world, that's a massive shift. It's a real game changer. What has the journey that you've been on with your meditation practice taught you about opening up to that divine presence of love, and how much of a difference has that made to you?
When I first started, it was a theoretical idea. I thought, okay, there's a sense in meditation that you're a soul, you're a non-physical being, and you can connect to something greater than yourself. So I really took it as sort of a scientific experiment, really. And I thought, okay, I don't really believe this, but I'll try it anyway. And so it was empirical evidence. So for myself, I started with the idea, but then I began to practice as if there was a divine being out there, as if there was an ocean of compassion or love or an energy that cared about me. And I would say gradually, I began to have a sense that I really was connecting with something. And then from time to time, extremely powerful experiences of connecting with this other being. I remember once I was sort of suddenly pulled into this world of light, and this being was in front of me, which just looked like a red, sort of pinkish orb, and this most beautiful energy of love and kindness and understanding was just suffusing me and coming to me, and it was saying, yes, I do exist, I am here. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, you're real. And I knew it wasn't my imagination, and it wasn't an hallucination. It was just an experience that happened in meditation. And so gradually over the years, I began to trust that, and I began to trust that connection with that being, and noticed when it turns up, when it turns up, you can feel it. It's like a friend. It's like an energy that's in your world. You can call on it. When you know yourself better, and this is a lovely question from the self-compassion practices, what do I need? What do I need? Now, where can I get that from? I can try and get it from other people. I can try and get it from the outside world, but all that's fairly, it fluctuates. It might be reliable, but often it's not. So what do I need? And the more I practice being a soul and realize what I really am is love and peace, and really everything I need I have within me. And then on top of that, I have this amazing energy that's there, that's the universal parent, that's there for me to connect with. So if I am feeling sad, if I am feeling unloved, if I am feeling frightened, if I am feeling unsafe, if I am feeling lonely, I can turn to that energy and get my needs met. And I think for me, that's been absolutely this relationship of the universal parent, the friend, the soul companion, the supreme soul, the divine, whatever name you want to put on it. It's an energy that I've come to know and love and recognize, and I know I can use. It's there to help me in my life. And so the more I draw on it, then the closer and more connected I feel, both to myself, to others, and to that energy.
In terms of managing our emotions, we can often get into feeling overwhelmed and as if we're, carrying the entire burden of everything on our own shoulders. And so this practice of, as you're talking about, connecting to this energy and to an extent being able to share that burden and maybe even offload that burden so that someone else can carry it for a while and leave you feeling free. That's not just a game you're playing with your mind. That can be something that is very real, that, as you're saying, it's something that you can experience in your life as really like an anchor for your emotional ups and downs.
Absolutely. I'm sure you've felt that too, Philippa. It's been something in your life that you've realised is a constant and that you can rely on. But it grows. It's like any relationship. The more you test it in a way, the more you try it out, the more you begin to see what comes back, and you learn to trust it, and it becomes like your parachute. It becomes your safety net.
Well, it's I mean, as I said, it's fascinating enough anyway, but for you to be speaking from this place of spanning these two worlds and saying, look, it's not a crazy idea to just at least be open to the idea that there is, a greater presence there that you can tap into, is very inspiring. And it would be lovely if before we close, you could just lead us in a guided meditation and maybe share with us some of your thoughts that you use when you're bringing your emotional complexities to a place of calm and equilibrium so that we can experience for ourselves what you're talking about. That would be great.
Okay. What I like to do when I'm meditating is just to bring myself into the present moment. So I'd invite you all just to relax wherever you're sitting or standing. You can have your eyes half open or closed, whatever works best for you. Just notice what are the sounds in your environment that you're hearing. And then to bring your awareness a little bit closer in, just noticing where in your body you're holding on to any tension. Let your shoulders drop, your legs be relaxed, your arms by your side or in your lap. Just scanning your body and noticing, where am I holding on to stress in my body, and let it go. And then coming in closer still and just noticing the rhythm of my breath. Breathing in and breathing out. And how soothing that rhythm is. It's like the waves of a gentle ocean lapping at the shore. Breathing in and breathing out. And then coming in closer still, noticing the thoughts that are going through my mind. But I'm standing back a little, like I'm in front of a stream and the thoughts are just passing in front of me. I'm observing them. Noticing any feelings that might be arising as well. Am I feeling uncomfortable or tense or relaxed? Just noticing and acknowledging wherever I'm at right now and accepting it. And then going deeper still, even beneath my thoughts and feelings, into a stillness, into a peace, into a sense of safety. Knowing this is who I truly am. I am the energy of love, of peace, of stillness. And as I experience myself in this way, let me be open to connecting with an ocean of love. A universal source of kindness, of compassion, of support. An energy that's there always to be my friend and to connect with and give me energy and love whenever I need it. And I can breathe in this love, soak it up. And it heals me. And makes me whole again. And then gradually opening my eyes or coming back out to the world, connecting with my breath, but bringing that peace and love with me, knowing that at my core, my essence, my real identity, that is who I am. So, Philippa, I hope that's been of help to you. We've covered a lot of territory, and I'm sure we could have more conversations on this topic. It's very deep and wide.
It's been absolutely wonderful to talk to someone who's had these two parallel journeys of being a meditation practitioner as well as a healthcare practitioner, and finding the meeting points and how each can contribute to the other's understanding. It's been wonderful. So Dr. Sarah Eagger, Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Philippa.
Thank you. And thank you to you as well for joining us from where you are. I hope you will take in some of these ideas in managing emotions that Sarah's been sharing, some very practical advice and tips there. So until we see you again, hopefully on tomorrow's masterclass, in the meantime, take good care, keep safe, Om Shanti, and goodbye. "21 Masterclasses in New Consciousness, New Ways of Thinking, Being and Doing for the New You." Pioneering thinkers from countries right around the world.
Awakening to a new way of living.